A very good day to all of the wise viewers and watchers. Welcome to a special conversation with Professor Gyan Prakash, who's agreed to join us very late in the night today. It's a Wednesday morning in India and Tuesday late night where Professor Gyan Prakash is. He's a historian at Princeton University. He studied in India, he has studied in the US, and he is presently there. And he's a scholar in all manner of things. He's a specialist in South Asian history, but his work spans across sort of urban geographies, colonial history, post-colonial theory, urban stuff, and the history of science. So he has innumerable books to his credit. I've read some of them. I've been deeply envious of others, hoping that I'd written parts of some of those. But I think we are really concerned here with his latest work, which is a very interesting and important work that comes from a time when Professor Gyan Prakash has experience of it as somebody living through the times and also has cast his sort of scholarly lens and gaze on it. I'm referring to his book, The Emergency Chronicles, Indira Gandhi and Democracy's Turning Point. Professor Gyan Prakash, welcome to The Wire.
Thank you, Seema, and thank you for that very generous introduction.
No, it was a very limited one. May I say? I would have liked to go on. Um, so you've written the Emergency Chronicles, as I said, because you were actually there, kind of bearing witness to what was happening, and you've also kind of looked at it, of course, clearly as a scholar and as a historian. You look back; the book came out in 2018. There is a certain character there called Prabir Purkayastha, um,
Yes.
who is almost like a linchpin of the argument, or at least a very, very important symbol when you kind of explain what is happening in the emergency. So I'd like you to kind of dwell on Prabir Purkayastha then in 1975 and what's happening with Prabir Purkayastha has been arrested under UAPA. He now edits, he's the editor of the news portal NewsClick, and he's under arrest as we speak under an act which is meant to kind of stall terrorism and stop terrorism in the country. So I'd like to read a little bit from your book with your permission, Professor Gyan Prakash. You
Sure.
write, so you talk about when Prabir Purkayastha, then a student at JNU, is sitting there and he's kind of waiting for his colleagues, comrades, and friends to join them briefly before they can start walking to the library. Around 10 a.m., a black car drove through the main gate, turned left, and continued toward the School of Languages. It was an ambassador, one of the three automobile models manufactured in India, and one invariably used by officialdom. At the wheel was a physically imposing Sikh, the DIG, Deputy Inspector General of Delhi Police, P.S. Bhinder. With him were T.R. Anand, a Deputy Superintendent of Police, and two constables, all in plain clothes. The car stopped near the students. Bhinder got out, walked over to Prabir and asked, "Are you Devi Prasad Tripathi?" Prabir replied that he was not. The next moment, he found himself being pushed toward the car. His friends rushed to save him from the plainclothesmen and momentarily succeeded in pulling him away from the car. Prabir also resisted, but the policeman beat back the students, lifted Prabir off his feet, and shoved him into the rear seat. Prabir's friends screamed for help. One of them rushed to the driver's side and tried to snatch the car keys from the ignition. But Bhinder came from behind, grabbed her hair, and hurled her to the ground. A flicker of hope rose momentarily in Prabir when he locked sights with a small group of students standing nearby, witnessing his ordeal. But it died as quickly as it had arisen when he saw them turn away with fear in their eyes. With the constables holding the slender, long frame of a struggling Probir in the rear seat, his legs jutting out of the open door, the car reversed in high speed, turned in the direction of the entry gate, and raced out of the campus. And as we know, Prabir after that goes on to serve a fairly long sentence. A few others of his fellow students, some of them who are now leaders, get arrested. So tell us about Prabir then, and why is he the star of this book, really, if I may use that phrase?
Yeah. Well, I knew Prabir. I didn't know him very well, but I knew him when I was a student at JNU as well. While I wasn't actually present at this incident of Bhinder grabbing him, but when I came down from my hostel room in the evening, I heard about it, and so so I knew about this incident. And when I started researching the emergency, Uh, since JNU had been at the kind of center of many of these arrests, I thought I would include what happened in JNU as part of the story. And once I made that decision, of course, Prabir's case, jumped out. And then I also found that in the Shah Commission report, there was, considerable of, few pages devoted to his particular case. And then in the actual depositions, not in the report itself, but in the actual depositions, I found a lot more material. Uh, so what happened to Prabir at that time was terrible. Of course, it compares nothing to what's going on now. But looking at what had happened during the emergency, Prabir's case, in a way, encapsulated what I call in the book lawful suspension of the law, where various laws that are on the books could be unlawfully invoked um, to put someone like him in prison. So, as I researched his case, it was clear that there was no warrant of arrest and against him under MISA. But once they had arrested him, they had to justify it somehow. So they, basically intimidated the ADM to issue a warrant of arrest in his name. So in a way, that encapsulated, you know, uh, some of the things that went on during the emergency. And I think he became also a kind of a thread through which I could tell the longer story of the emergency. Because emergency happens against a background of student unrest, um, and the student unrest of which Prabir was a part and an expression of, sort of a radical youth in the 60s. And the emergency, if you just take it away from the immediate background of the Allahabad judgment, but see it in a kind of a broader frame, has to be placed against that, context of student unrest and crisis in India in the late 60s and early 70s. So himself being a product of that milieu, uh, Prabir's case then, for me, seemed like uh, a very apt character through which the story of the emergency could be told.
You speak about okay, is it correct to call that the first emergency? Would we be correct as we look back in 2023?
Um you mean in relation to what's going on now?
Correct.
A lot of people call this undeclared emergency. Um, I personally disagree with it because I think that this is uh, something far more serious. Uh, and in terms of the kind of a long term history of India from now onwards, much more consequential. Um I When I think about what's going on now, and particularly with what's happened with Prabir, um, I th- I'm often reminded of the writings on totalitarianism, um, where I mean two things stand out um with his arrest. One is a relentless effort to clear the public sphere of any dissent. Um, they've already largely accomplished it, through the television media, newspaper media, and so on. And they are now also trying to clear any dissent in social media, on the internet, and so on. So it's not surprising that they've gone after someone like Prabir and NewsClick. Okay, uh, so what we are witnessing now is an attempt to create, really, I think, a totalitarian society in which every thought that deviates from the officially prescribed one is already suspect. So, in that sense, potentially, any human being who thinks is a suspect in this regime. Because if you think, you can change your mind, you can think differently, you can express dissent. Uh, Simply your capacity to think and critique makes you a suspect. Okay. So that is happening all over. I mean, there's a case of Tista. I mean, Koregaon. I mean, there are so many examples where you can see this. The second aspect of this, which is also in a way different from the emergency and is far graver, is to really achieve a total domination through killing the juridical person in a human being or in a citizen. Okay, and you do that by creating a system of law that is outside the normal penal system. So you don't, file an FIR, charge him with kind of a normal, criminal procedures, but you charge him through UAPA, which creates a completely different sort of circle. I'm not being hyperbolic, but it is comparable to the way in which the concentration camp functioned. That concentration camp was outside the normal penal system. People who went there had no rights. They were outside any kind of juridical system, any protection of law. And so you now create criminal, you create a terrorist uh, by completely killing all the kind of a juridical protection that a citizen has or a human being has under a system of law. So if you think of these two aspects, that every thought is suspect, every human being by his very capacity to think is a suspect, and creation of this a system of law that is outside the normal penal system. Um, these point to a form of autocracy that Indira Gandhi never achieved during the emergency. So, bad enough though it was for Prabir to be arrested without any reason, um, it was very different from being arrested under UPA, where there's no protection of law at all.
Yeah. The two things you said, like I think, therefore I am, is I think, therefore I'm a suspect, that kind of transformation. And number two, the way the law is kind of spun around a person who they want to kind of criminalize or put away. So is that also the distinct difference? Because in, say, the emergency, you were jailed for being a journalist, which is, of course, happening in India too. And in Kashmir, we've seen that just the act of reporting is cited in charge sheets, etc., that you reported on a certain activity as being enough to send you to prison. So, and also, as they say, that whatever happens, it's the opposite of Las Vegas. Whatever happens in Kashmir does get to the rest of India. We'll
Yeah.
soon be subject to what's happening there. But do you think this is the fundamental way, in also a way in which it's also different from the emergency?
It's also different. I mean, in a way, censorship during the emergency was, in fact, an expression of Indira Gandhi's weakness, that she couldn't control the press. And so she censored it.
Yeah.
Here, they use censorship controls, but in addition, they own the media. So they actually don't need to do this. But what do you do about these kind of dissenting voices that pop up on the internet or social media and so on? that's where you create the system uh, where any normal protection that you would get from law is unavailable to you. So this is very different. Yeah. So what they did in Kashmir, of course, in a way you could compare that to the emergency, but I mean, I think the scale, firstly, the scale of what's going on is very different, and that's why I don't use the term undeclared emergency, because it actually, I think, minimizes the graveness of what's going on.
Yeah. So you've kind of spoken about it, but I want to like just again bring back the focus that there was a very clear way in which people like Prabir threatened the Indira Gandhi regime, if you like, or so they were being picked and kind of put away, student unrest and all that. Uh, in what way do people like Prabir kind of hurt a government which has been elected twice with a pure majority, which has more than 300 Lok Sabha seats? There is a virtual cult kind of thing here. We had G20 on recently, where we had at least 20 kind of faces traveling. Forget about the 1.4 billion Indian faces. You had posters with just the one face. You had just Mr. Modi sort of wall. It was like just this kind of we were carpet bombed with Mr. Modi's face, even at G20. Why is that a threat? I mean, it's small. I mean, there are massive troll armies which aren't even properly troll armies. They are like baked into the official uh, push, the propaganda push that this government does, the ruling party does, and the Washington Post has extensive pieces on that. Others have reported, the Wires have reported also. Why are kind of individuals a threat to such a large, big machine, which also has the full power of the Indian state, which is like a thing in itself? It's like a fusion of these two things. Why should we be scared?
Well, I mean, I was just the other day rereading Hannah Arendt on totalitarianism, and one of the things that she says is that uh, in a totalitarian society, there are always non-totalitarian elements that are beyond the control of the totalitarians. Uh, And people in power are always aware that there is something that is not under their control. There's always a fear. I mean, look at, for example, the way in which the news of Rahul Gandhi's Bharat Jodo Yatra was completely blacked out in
Yeah.
the Indian media. I mean, we read about it here in, in New York Times and in other media, Danish media, European media. Um, so there is this constant fear uh, in a totalitarian society, and she writes about Hitler also. That in spite of all the power that he enjoyed, there was always this kind of lurking suspicion that there are non-totalitarian elements which are not completely under our control. So much of the propaganda is often directed at drawing those people who are not completely under its ideological indoctrination. And those people, if they are not brought under completely their ideology, then you use whatever state apparatus that you can against them. So, i- i- in a way, I mean, she what she writes about, you create a kind of fictitious reality where people in power feel that they have absolute control, even as they know that there are sections that are outside their society. So there is a kind of a paranoia that is built into these totalitarian regimes, which, on the one hand, want to dominate, and yet there is a fear that perhaps their control is not total. And so it's a machine that keeps, uh, triggering more and more attempts at control. So, uh, you know, by itself, you may think like, Prabir, he's not a threat. He was not a threat to Indira Gandhi. He's not a threat to Modi. Uh, but they're not thinking of Prabir as such. but Prabir in this kind of a wider arena of achieving total control, in which all of these things become reminders of the lack of control that they have.
Scorched about termites, yes. My last
Yeah.
two questions, Professor Gyan Prakash, the tough one first.
Mm,
I'm a journalist, I'm a hack. I'm not expected to know what happens other than the immediate term or max medium term. You're a
mm,
historian, you've studied longer spans. How does all this end? End it has to. But how do systems like these, which are not an emergency, which are
mm,
totalitarian, which come in through popular vote,
mm,
which enjoy state power, which
mm.
believe in focus and centralization, how does it end? What does the last scene of this film look like? I can see you have Barsat's kind of a poster behind you. But what would
Yeah.
be the title of this film? How's this going to end? It has to end.
Well, I mean, the day after is the most important one.
Ah,
Uh,
that's
we
also the
just
name of a film. Yeah. Okay.
we just had actually just last weekend a seminar on democracy and transition, but most of the discussion was really about Eastern Europe. But this was the question. So in Poland, there is an election coming up on October 15th, and there were a lot of Polish scholars and scholars of Hungary and so on. And the uppermost thing in their mind is, if by some uh, great fortune, I mean, although it seems possible that they manage to defeat the ruling regime in Poland, what happens the day after? Because what, meanwhile, these regimes have done, and as BJP has done in India, um, is to not only enact a series of laws like the UAPA amendment in 2019, CAA, I mean, the whole host of things, various kinds of administrative practices, using of ED, using of income tax. I mean, they've unleashed so many of these kind of administrative machines that it'll be very difficult for a regime that comes into power after that to undo it. Uh, so one of the first things that how does it end? I mean, I think the first thing that it ends is hopefully 2024 it ends uh, with you know uh, India winning over uh, the BJP. But I think the real challenge would be uh, a undoing all of these kind of administrative things that they have done, and b actually the poison that they have disseminated in the populace. Because what's happened also, I mean, in this way also, this is so different from the emergency that you know Indira Gandhi had youth congress, but the youth congress was nothing, you know compared to the kind of a ground troops that the RSS is able to deploy and that the BJP is able to deploy. And actually, all this uh, really poisonous and vitriolic sort of ideology that they've spread in the population. I mean, things that you wouldn't say in polite society about 20 years ago. People feel free to say that. How do you put genie back in the bottle? So, I mean, I think those are the real challenges in thinking about what happens the day after. Uh, so, the day itself is not as important as the day after, I think.
Okay, that's like very thoughtful and very guided. And yeah, we must temper optimism even on when it ends. So coming back to Prabir, Professor Gyan Prakash, I've kind of had long conversations with him about his jail friends. A lot of them were Sangh leaders,
Mhm,
senior important leaders. Some of them went on to be presidents of the BJP, which didn't exist then.
mhm,
There was only the Jan
mhm,
Sangh and there was the RSS.
mhm,
RSS and Jan Sangh go on about emergency repression. They celebrated 40 years, so much of tamasha.
mhm.
How do you reconcile that with at least in large part, aspiring to be this kind of autocrat, this despot, this love for being the supreme kind of monarchical kind of despot, the wanting to self anoint and self appoint? How do you square, or is there no contradiction? That was just
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I too remember talking to Prabir about his jail years and, being pretty friends with, these were his fellow detainees, many of them were in RSS and,
desperate to get out and desperate to kind
yeah,
of sign on mafinamas of all sorts.
yeah, and in a way, both the RSS and SFI and CPM shared a kind of a common hatred for BJP. I mean, so
For the
there
Congress, I mean, for Indira Gandhi
Congress,
at that time.
yeah,
Yeah,
Indira Gandhi at that time. So uh, now those same Congress people, I mean, the Jansangh people, now BJP and RSS, who used to speak about and regularly every emergency
till very recently.
anniversary,
Yes,
yeah,
yeah,
they speak about, and they often say, "Oh, we never did this," and Congress did that. Uh, for them to become uh, this kind of autocrat, uh, there are two things I would say. One is that, in a way, a certain predilection for a Hindu Rashtra was already there in the RSS.
yeah. I think
And
that is a bedrock of their kind of ideological. Yeah,
yeah, and that Hindu Rashtra, not just in terms of majoritarianism, but also a kind of a
yeah,
state.
yeah.
Okay. So that was already there. But I think there was a transformation in the BJP itself as a party after 2014, really, under Modi, where, you know, if you think of BJP prior to 2014, there were a number of leaders. There was Advani, um, there was Arun Jaitley. I mean, you could think of, Chauhan in Madhya Pradesh. There were a number of leaders. It was, some people call it kind of a normal political party in that sense. All that changed after 2014, where Modi became the singular kind of focus of the party. So that way, party has changed. Uh, and it also changed in the sense that it got an opportunity to create a party state that it never had before. Uh, so for them to speak about emergency and being a Democrat, I mean, what can I say? You can.
Comedy? Is it funny comedy or
No, it's a
dark
comedy,
comedy?
but it's not just. I mean, I don't think it's just hypocrisy, because
No, it's not.
hypocrisy invokes a kind of a language of morality. I think it's something much bigger than that. It's uh, again, if I go back to Hannah Arendt, and when Hannah Arendt talks about, now, why does Hitler constantly lie? And he lies all the time. Okay? And you see the same thing with the present regime. Uh, you wouldn't publish certain GDP data, you wouldn't publish unemployment data. Uh, why do you do this? Now, this is not just hypocrisy. And that's why I say that, here there is a drive to create a totalitarian state, uh, in which, you know, the idea of a lie being a lie, it just doesn't register, you know. Uh, Within the frame in which they are thinking, all of this is true. And that's why, this regime is a post-truth regime, and it's a regime in which you can't shame them. You can't say, "Oh, you used to say this, and now look what you're doing."
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't work. And I've seen it over here also, with Trump supporters. You can't shame them because they are in a kind of different frame where they have a model of government that is fundamentally anti democratic, uh, which is based on the worship of a leader, and whatever the leader says is true. Uh, so he can, with a straight face, he can say, oh, India is a mother of democracy, when he's making it a graveyard of democracy.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's like put so well. So while we do realize, and I think you've explained that very nicely and succinctly as well, as to why that was not the first emergency and this is not the second, but just in order to recognize the beast that is upon us and is upon democratic India today, I'd recommend we kind of read this. And I've read this twice already. And this is before yesterday. So we'll read this and reflect. And those are very thoughtful ideas about how that was to lawfully create a system of control and of domination. And this is something completely, completely different. Thank you so much for destroying your evening and speaking to us on a
No,
late
no,
evening from Princeton. Thanks, Professor Gyan Prakash.
no, my pleasure. It's my pleasure to speak about Prabir, and I feel terrible that he's had to go through this twice in his life.
Yes, but thank you for turning up to tell us all about it. That's half the
Okay,
battle fought, I think. Thank you so much. And
okay, thank you.
goodbye to all our viewers of The Wire. Bye bye.
Okay.